We talked about recently that I sent you was this new AI ability, that AI has the ability to translate some of these ancient languages now, which is really interesting.
For 4,500 years, we have been told the Sphinx has a father, a pharaoh who commissioned it, a dynasty that dated it, a name printed in every textbook, repeated in every documentary, carved so deep into the official record that nobody thought to ask the stone itself whether the story was true. Then a team of researchers did something no Egyptologist had ever done. They took every scan, every survey, every measurement ever collected on the Great Sphinx of Giza, and they fed it to an artificial intelligence that had never read a textbook, never sat through a lecture, never built a career on getting the answer right. They asked Grok a simple question. What actually happened to this stone? It didn't confirm the story we've been told for 2 centuries. It found a signature buried in the erosion patterns that shouldn't exist for another 7,000 years before the pharaoh who supposedly built it was even born. The stone remembers something we were never supposed to notice. Picture it the way millions of tourists see it every year. A lion's body the length of a football field, stretched out on the Giza Plateau, facing due east with a patience that makes human history look brief by comparison. 73 meters long, 20 meters tall, carved from a single ridge of bedrock that geologists say was already sitting there before the first stone of the first pyramid was ever quarried. For most of modern history, the story attached to this monument has been treated as settled, not debated, not questioned, settled, the way we treat the boiling point of water or the distance to the moon. But monuments don't lie the way people do. People can write an inscription and call it history. Stone can only record what actually happened to it, one season at a time, whether anyone is around to read the record or not. And for over 60 years, a small group of outsiders has been pointing at that record and saying, "This doesn't match the story we were told." Now, for the first time, that record has been handed to something with no stake in either side of the argument, no tenure to protect, no excavation funding on the line, no reputation built on being right, just raw data. And a question. What we're about to walk through is what came back. Before we get into what Grok found underneath its paws, hit subscribe, because this channel is where the rest of this network gets decoded, one buried site at a time. The story we were handed. Let's start with the version everyone already knows, because you can't understand why this AI analysis is so unsettling until you understand how confident the old answer used to be. Around 2500 BCE, in Egypt's 4th dynasty, a king named Khafre sat on the throne. He was the son of Khufu, the pharaoh credited with the Great Pyramid, and he wanted his own legacy standing on the Giza Plateau. His workers were already quarrying limestone blocks for his pyramid complex, and in the process, they left behind a long ridge of stone, a leftover, a byproduct of the excavation. According to the mainstream account, Khafre's builders looked at that leftover ridge and saw an opportunity. Instead of hauling it away, they shaped it. They carved a lion's body stretched low to the ground, powerful and watchful, and gave it a human face modeled, according to tradition, on the king himself, half man, half beast, staring at the rising sun for eternity, a guardian standing sentry over his tomb. The evidence for this dating isn't nothing. The Sphinx sits directly inside Khafre's temple complex, connected by a causeway to his pyramid. Around 1400 BCE, over 1,000 years after Khafre's reign, a young prince named Thutmose fell asleep in the Sphinx's shadow and dreamed that the monument spoke to him. promising him the throne if he cleared the sand burying its body. When he became pharaoh, he kept his promise and erected a granite slab between the Sphinx's paws, describing the vision. That slab still stands there today, and it associates the monument with the sun god, which is exactly what you'd expect from a 4th Dynasty royal guardian. Mark Lehner, one of the most respected Egyptologists of the last 50 years, spent over a decade mapping the Giza Plateau stone by stone. He walked away from that work convinced the archaeological and geological context both pointed firmly to Khafre's era. A workforce of a few thousand men, copper tools, wooden mallets, and roughly 20 years of labor. Case closed, as far as most of the field was concerned. For a long time, that was where the conversation ended. The Sphinx had a father, a date, and a purpose, and the matter was considered resolved the way most settled questions in archaeology are resolved, through consensus, repetition, and the simple fact that nobody had found a reason compelling enough to reopen the file. But the monument itself never agreed to close that file. It just sat there, weathering in ways nobody had bothered to examine closely enough. The problem written in water. Here's the part of the story most people never hear because it doesn't fit neatly into a museum placard. Look past the face of the Sphinx and study the walls of the pit surrounding it. The deep trench that was cut into the bedrock to free the lion's body from the surrounding rock. That trench and the body itself are covered in a very specific kind of damage, and geology is unforgiving about what kind of damage looks like what. If a monument spends 4,500 years sitting in a desert, the wear pattern is predictable. Wind-blown sand scours horizontally, leaving a pitted, directional roughness. Think of sandpaper, dragged sideways across stone over and over for centuries. Salt crystallization does something different. It works from the inside out, growing crystals inside the pores of the rock until the surface crumbles into a pockmarked, flaky texture. Neither of those patterns is what's actually carved into the Sphinx enclosure. What's there instead are deep, rounded, vertical channels, grooves that start narrow near the top of the wall and widen as they travel downward, undulating like something was flowing, not blowing. That shape is the signature of one thing, and one thing only: heavy, sustained rainfall running down a vertical rock face, season after season, for a very long time. Not a single storm, not one flash flood. The slow, repetitive carving of rain that fell for centuries. A French scholar named René Schwaller de Lubitsch noticed this back in 1961, though almost nobody outside a small circle of researchers paid attention. Decades later, an independent researcher named John Anthony West picked up the thread and turned it into a formal argument. But the moment that actually forced the scientific community to pay attention came in 1991, when Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University with no ideological stake in Egyptology, stood up at the Geological Society of America's annual meeting and presented his findings. He had physically walked the enclosure walls, measured the erosion profiles, and compared them against known weathering signatures from around the world. His conclusion was blunt. The primary force that shaped those walls was precipitation, and the amount of rainfall required to cut channels that deep into limestone, that dense, has not fallen on the Giza Plateau in any meaningful quantity since roughly 5000 BCE. That number matters more than it sounds like it should. Egypt has been a desert for a long, long time, but it wasn't always. Between roughly 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, North Africa experienced what climatologists call the African humid period, sometimes nicknamed the Green Sahara. Grasslands, lakes, rivers, an entire ecosystem that has since vanished completely under sand. That wet period tapered off and finally ended around 3,500 BCE, with the heaviest rains disappearing even earlier than that. So here's the collision nobody in the mainstream story wants to sit with. If the Sphinx really was carved in 2,500 BCE, it would have spent its entire existence in the same bone-dry climate we see today. Its body should show wind and sand damage, nothing else. Instead, it shows the fingerprint of a climate that vanished from that region thousands of years before Khafre was even born. For that erosion to physically exist, the Sphinx would have had to already be standing while that rain was still falling. That single observation created a standoff that lasted for decades. Robert Schoch, pointing at the water damage, Mark Lehner and the Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, pointing at the architectural context and the historical record. Neither side had the tool to force the other to budge, until somebody decided to stop asking humans for their opinion and started asking a machine for a measurement, handing the stone to a machine. Here's the reasoning behind that decision, and it's worth sitting with, because it's the whole premise of what follows. Every human expert who has ever studied the Sphinx walked into that study already carrying something. A career built on a particular interpretation, a department that expects a particular conclusion, funding that depends on not rocking the boat too hard in either direction. That's not a criticism of anyone's honesty. It's just how careers work. Nobody spends 15 years mapping a plateau and then casually torches their own life's conclusion the moment new data complicates it. An artificial intelligence doesn't have that problem. It has no publication history to protect, no colleagues to disappoint, no grant committee reading over its shoulder. It arrives at the evidence with nothing invested in the outcome. So the researchers behind this analysis gathered everything. Every published erosion survey ever conducted on the enclosure walls, high-resolution laser scans of the body and the trench, reconstructed climate models of the Eastern Sahara stretching back 40,000 years, built from Nile sediment cores and pollen samples pulled from ancient lake beds. Known weathering rates for limestone of that exact density and hardness under sustained rainfall. And the results of a 1992 ground-penetrating survey conducted by geophysicist Thomas Dobecki, working alongside Robert Schoch, which had detected an anomalous void in the bedrock beneath the Sphinx's pores, a feature nobody had ever fully explained. They didn't tell the model which side of the debate to land on. They fed it the raw measurements and asked it to describe what the measurements actually showed. Grok's first task was to treat the erosion not as an impression, but as a geometry problem. It measured the depth of every groove along the enclosure wall, the curvature of every ridge, the vertical spacing between each wave of erosion. Then it ran that geometry against three known signatures: wind-driven sand, salt crystallization, and sustained rainfall, and asked which one actually fit the numbers. The result? A 94.7% confidence rating that the dominant erosive force was rainfall. Wind and sand, the explanation the official chronology depends on, scored a fraction of that. Not zero, not impossible, just statistically overwhelmed by a different answer. But a confidence score by itself doesn't finish the argument, it just narrows it. So the researchers pushed the model further, with the question the human debate had circled for 30 years, without ever fully nailing down. How long would rain of that intensity need to fall in order to cut channels that specific depth into stone that specific hardness? Weathering rates for limestone under known rainfall intensities are measurable. Geologists have documented them in dozens of other contexts around the world. Grok applied those rates against the rainfall reconstructions from the wettest phase of the Green Sahara and returned an estimate. The enclosure walls needed to have been exposed to sustained heavy rainfall for a period measured in centuries, at minimum, for the erosion depth to exist at all. And the last time rainfall at that intensity fell on the Giza Plateau ended somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 years before the pharaoh credited with building the monument ever took the throne. Read that back slowly. Not a few hundred years of wiggle room. Not an academic rounding error historians could shrug off. 7,000 years. An engineer who reviewed the output afterward described it in a way that stuck with everyone who heard it. The stone was behaving like a witness. It didn't know what story it was supposed to support. It simply recorded what happened to it, one rainy season at a time, and stored that record in its own decay. And the record it held did not match the story that had been built around it. The head that doesn't fit. If you've ever stood in front of the Sphinx in person, or even just stared at a well-lit photograph for more than a few seconds, there's a decent chance you felt something slightly off without being able to name it. The body is enormous. A sprawling lion's form, stretched across an enclosure roughly the size of a city block. And sitting on top of that massive frame is a head that looks somehow too small, slightly wrong, like it was borrowed from a different sculpture entirely. Nobody had to guess at this feeling anymore. Grok measured it directly, the volume of the head against the volume of the body, and the proportional ratio any sculptor working from a single unified plan would naturally maintain between the two. The numbers didn't disagree slightly, they disagreed dramatically. If the figure had been carved with the head in correct anatomical proportion to that body, the head sitting there today would need to be several times larger than it actually is. Which opens up a question that sounds almost too simple to be as unsettling as it actually is. What if the head currently on the Sphinx was never the original head at all? Robert Schoch had floated exactly this idea years earlier in his own work. His theory was that the human face we see today was carved much later than the body, possibly during the Old Kingdom, by reshaping an already ancient, already weathered block into a royal likeness. Its comparatively rough preservation, in his view, wasn't just erosion. It was evidence of a second carving, cut into stone that had already spent millennia being shaped by an earlier hand. Grok found something that made this theory harder to dismiss than a hunch. The erosion pattern on the head does not match the erosion pattern on the body. The flanks and the enclosure walls carry that unmistakable rainfall signature, deep, rounded, vertical channels built by centuries of running water. The head carries a completely different profile, sharper edges, drier wear, the kind of scouring you'd expect from long-term exposure to wind-blown sand in an arid climate. Two different weathering signatures on the same monument means two different climates touched two different parts of it. And two different climates touching the same object only happens one way: if those two parts were shaped at two separate points in time. The body endured the rains. The head did not. Whatever face is looking out over the Giza Plateau today was added onto a structure that was already ancient by the time someone carved it. So Grok reconstructed what the original volume would have looked like, working backward from the proportions the body actually demands. What came out the other end wasn't a human head at all. It was a correctly scaled leonine head sitting atop a leonine body, a complete lion from nose to tail, with nothing human about it. Hold on to that image for a moment, because it's the hinge the rest of this analysis turns on. A complete lion, not a hybrid, not a guardian with a pharaoh's face. A lion, whole and unmodified. And the question that naturally follows is, when would a lion have actually made sense to build? Not artistically, astronomically. The age of Leo. The Sphinx faces due east. Every survey ever conducted on the site confirms the same thing to within an arc minute. It is staring directly at the exact point on the horizon where the sun rises on the morning of the spring equinox. That alignment isn't a coincidence of geography. Somebody chose it, and chose it with real precision. But here's the detail most people never learn in school. The sky itself isn't fixed. Earth's axis wobbles slowly over thousands of years, a motion astronomers call the precession of the equinoxes. Because of that wobble, the backdrop of stars behind the rising sun on any given date slowly shifts, about 1 degree every 72 years. A full cycle of that wobble takes roughly 25,920 years to complete, and along the way, each zodiacal constellation takes its turn, rising with the equinox sun for a window of roughly 2,160 years before handing off to the next. So Grok ran the sky backward. It reconstructed the exact position of the stars over the eastern horizon at Giza, equinox by equinox, working back through millennia, watching for the one specific window when a lion, Leo, would have been the constellation, rising directly behind the sun on the morning the year turned. The window it found, somewhere between roughly 10,500 and 8,000 years before the present. For those 2,500 years, Leo sat low and burning on the eastern horizon at dawn, on the equinox, precisely where the Sphinx has been staring the entire time anyone has recorded its existence. This wasn't a brand new idea invented by an AI out of nowhere. Researchers Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval proposed a version of this exact connection back in their 1996 book on the subject. What's different here is that Grok arrived at essentially the same window independently, working purely from raw astronomical data with no awareness of what conclusion it was supposedly meant to reach. A lion on the ground, carved from solid bedrock, staring for eternity at a lion rising in the sky. Not a guardian for a king's tomb, a marker locked to a single astronomical age, an age that ended thousands of years before the first pharaoh ever drew breath. The astronomer who reviewed this part of the analysis put it plainly. The odds that a randomly oriented monument would happen to face its own symbolic animal during that animal's own celestial age purely by chance are, in his words, effectively zero, which leaves two options on the table, and only two. Either this is the single most extraordinary coincidence in the entire history of human construction, or somebody standing on that plateau roughly 10,000 years ago understood exactly where Leo rose on the morning the year turned, built a lion facing that exact point, and left it there as a marker. A clock built from stone, set to run for 10,000 years, waiting for someone with enough rebuilt mathematics to finally read it. The grid beneath the story. A marker only matters if it's pointing at something. Once Grok anchored the Sphinx to the age of Leo, the next step was obvious. Look at what else sits on that same axis, starting directly underneath the monument, then widening outward across the entire planet. Remember that 1992 seismic survey the one that detected an unexplained void in the bedrock beneath the Sphinx's paws, roughly 9 meters by 12 meters, chamber-shaped. Grok cross-referenced the exact position of that void against the equinox sightline the Sphinx is locked onto. The chamber sits almost directly on that axis, as though whatever the lion was watching on the horizon had a mirror image buried directly beneath where it sits. From there, the analysis widened dramatically. Around the world, there are ancient sites that align themselves to solar and stellar events in ways that have never been fully explained by isolated cultural coincidence. Grok began plotting them on a single global map and measuring the angular relationships between them. Consider what ended up on that map. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a site of massive carved stone pillars, radiocarbon dated to between roughly 9,500 and 8,000 BCE, making it the oldest known monumental structure ever excavated, predating Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. Under the conventional timeline of human development, the people who built it shouldn't have had the social organization to pull it off, and yet they did, and then, for reasons still not understood, they deliberately buried the entire site themselves around 8,000 BCE. Then there's Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where interlocking polygonal stone blocks weighing up to 360 tons were fitted together with joints so exact that a knife blade cannot slide between them, with no mortar used at all, a level of precision modern engineers still struggle to fully explain, using tools plausibly available to the builders credited with it. And Stonehenge, on England's Salisbury Plain, where enormous bluestones were somehow transported roughly 240 miles from Wales, aligned with solar events that archaeoastronomers have confirmed to a fine degree, with construction dated to around 3000 BCE, though evidence suggests the site itself was in use long before that. When Grok measured the angular relationships between these sites and dozens of others like them, it didn't find scattered noise, the kind of loose pattern you'd expect from unrelated cultures, separately stumbling onto similar ideas. It found agreement, the same handful of angular proportions repeating from site to site, continent to continent, as though every one of these monuments had been measured against a single shared reference that no surviving civilization has ever documented. One structure aligned to the equinox is a sunrise. Two structures sharing that alignment is a coincidence worth a footnote. A dozen structures scattered across different continents, separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years, sharing not just the same solar target, but the same internal proportions and the same relationship to specific stellar positions. That isn't a coincidence anymore. That's a template, and a template implies somebody drew the original plan first. Then Grok found the detail that troubled the researchers more than any single alignment on its own. It ranked every site in the network by the precision of its construction, flatness of surfaces, tightness of joints, accuracy of astronomical alignment, expecting to see the pattern that defines basically every other story of human skill, rough beginnings, gradually refined into mastery over generations. We start crude and we improve. That's the story humanity tells about itself, because for most of recorded history, it's been true. The data told the opposite story. The oldest structures in the network were the most precisely built. The tightest joints belonged to the earliest sites. The most accurate alignments belonged to the earliest builders. And moving forward in time from those earliest monuments, quality steadily degraded. Angles drifted. Joints that once required no mortar began needing fill. Alignments once accurate to the arc minute began to wander. Grok summarized the finding in a single line. The precision curve is inverted. The builders weren't learning, they were forgetting. Sit with what that actually implies. The Sphinx and the global network it appears to anchor might not represent the dawn of civilization at all. They might be the final echo of something that had already peaked, the last competent work of a body of knowledge already in decline, preserved in stone precisely because stone is the one material that survives long after the people who understood it are gone. We've spent 2 centuries picturing ourselves as the highest point of human achievement, looking backward with a kind of gentle pity at the primitive people who stumbled their way toward what we eventually built. This analysis suggests something uncomfortable instead, that we might not be the summit of anything. We might be the recovery. The scar in the record. There's one date the entire network keeps circling back to. Roughly 12,000 years ago, the geological record shows a boundary that is violent and abrupt, a climate event called the Younger Dryas, one of the fastest, most severe temperature reversals of the last 100,000 years. Across the northern hemisphere, temperatures collapsed within decades. In North America, entire species of megafauna that had dominated the continent for tens of thousands of years vanished in what amounts to a geological instant. A hypothesis first proposed in 2007 by a research group including Richard Firestone of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory argued that this collapse was triggered or at least dramatically worsened by a comet or asteroid impact. The supporting evidence includes a thin layer of nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, and cosmic spherules found at numerous sites across North America and Europe, all sitting precisely at that same boundary. The hypothesis was formally published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and a follow-up study in 2018 identified the largest platinum anomaly ever recorded in an ice core sample at that exact same layer. Platinum being a substance that's almost non-existent in Earth's crust but present in certain types of asteroid material. Whatever actually caused it, the Younger Dryas was the kind of event that ends worlds, the kind of abrupt break that would leave whoever survived on the other side of it, working from fragments of a memory they could no longer fully reconstruct. And the monuments in this global network begin appearing in the archaeological record almost immediately after that event, starting around 10,000 to 9,500 BCE, once the ice had finally released its grip. There's one more piece that makes this even harder to dismiss. In the 12,000 years since the Younger Dryas, global sea levels have risen by roughly 120 meters, swallowing the coastal margins where the overwhelming majority of human populations have always chosen to settle. Whatever physical evidence a pre-catastrophe civilization might have left behind on those ancient coastlines is now sitting on the modern ocean floor, completely out of reach of conventional land-based archaeology. The monuments we can actually study today are, by definition, only the survivors, the ones built high enough and solid enough to outlast the flood that swallowed everything else. It's almost as if a people who watched the end of their world approaching did the one thing a dying civilization can actually do to speak across a catastrophe that size. They didn't write it down in a language, because languages die the moment the last speaker does. They carved it into stone, into angles, into astronomical alignments, encoded in a form that could only be read once some future civilization had rebuilt enough mathematics to decode it. A lion watching the dawn of its own astronomical age, a chamber sitting beneath its feet, locked to the same axis, a grid of markers spread across an entire planet, each one saying the same thing in the only language that actually survives everything, We were here. We knew. What Grok couldn't answer. There's one question Grok never managed to answer, and it might be the most unsettling part of this entire analysis. Warn us of what? The model found the message. It traced the geometry pointing toward it, mapped the network carrying it, dated the moment it was likely encoded. But the actual content, what the message was actually trying to say, it left blank. And that blank space might matter more than anything else that came back. We built a system with no agenda, no career to protect, no professional reputation riding on the outcome. We pointed it at the oldest object our civilization still argues about, and we asked it what it saw. It didn't hand us confirmation that we'd had the story right all along. It handed us a flaw much older than expected, a precision curve running backward, a global network nobody had fully mapped before, an astronomical lock dated to an age before agriculture, and the quiet suggestion that something existed before us that understood things we're only now starting to rebuild the tools to reconstruct. The Sphinx is still out there in the desert tonight, watching the same patch of horizon it's been watching since long before the first pharaoh drew breath. It never changed. It was never hiding anything from us. We simply didn't have the eyes to read what it was recording, until we finally built eyes capable of reading it, and handed them the stone. So here's what I actually want to know. If the Sphinx was built to watch the dawn of the Age of Leo, and that lion has been running like a clock for 10,000 years, what do you think it was counting toward? A memorial for something that already drowned? Or a warning about something that hasn't drowned yet? Tell me your honest read in the comments. And subscribe, because there are other sites on this network being analyzed right now, older ones, stranger ones, sitting on the same grid, and you're going to want to be here when those results come back. The lion has been staring at that horizon for a very long time. The only thing that's changed is that we finally turned around to look at what it was watching.